All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. 27 days ago, Hurricane Helene hit western North Carolina, leaving a trail of destruction in our beautiful mountains that will not soon be forgotten. Even before this storm hit, and every day since, emergency responders have worked around the clock to save lives and to stabilize the area. We know parts of our mountains were hard to reach even on a sunny day before the storm. So the challenge of clearing debris and reaching people after the devastation has been monumental. But I am so grateful for the people who are spending countless hours working to help our state. The first responders, the National Guard, active duty soldiers, the emergency operations workers, line workers, healthcare providers, DOT personnel, volunteers, and so many more. All of them are heroes, and all of them deserve our deepest thanks. I've traveled to western North Carolina regularly since this storm, and I've seen the amazing ways, big and small, that communities have come together to support each other. From a neighbor jumping into raging waters to save a woman, to young people who helped turn a hotel into a place where a whole neighborhood could come for hot suppers and needed household supplies. Natural disasters are hard to compare. A life lost, a business destroyed, a home full of memories washed away. No matter where it is, even if it's just one, is always a tragedy. But it is no exaggeration to describe Helene as the deadliest and most damaging storm ever to hit North Carolina. We mourn the deaths of 96 people and send deepest condolences to their friends and family. And as we shift efforts from response to recovery, we've begun to understand what the long-term needs will be for western North Carolina. In 2018, after Hurricane Florence struck, my administration oversaw the assessment of needs for the eastern part of our state. And I reported what was then a record $17 billion in damages. Now here we are, 6 years later, reporting on the damage brought by another storm that is even more catastrophic. Over the last weeks, my office and our Office of State Management and Budget, or OSBM, has worked day and night with local governments and state agencies to assess the extent and the cost of the damages. OSBM estimates today that the cost of the damage from Hurricane Helene in western North Carolina is roughly $53 billion, more than 3 times the damage inflicted by Florence. Since the storm hit, we've made important progress, delivering food and water and medicine, reconnecting power and cell phone service, reopening schools and roads. But this jaw-dropping damage figure reminds us that we are very much on the front end of this recovery effort. Today, I'm sharing a report to the General Assembly that details the losses that make up the $53 billion, what we expect private insurance to cover, what we hope the federal government can cover, and what we will need state government to step up to provide. The initial state funding request we are making today is $3.9 billion, a down payment on western North Carolina's future. Evidence from past storms shows that communities that recover fastest and strongest are the ones that get fast and strong investment after the storm. This proposal, built on the assessment of damage sustained and lessons learned from past storms, would give western North Carolina a jump start on recovery. This funding represents immediate help for small businesses. Just last week, I signed an executive order increasing unemployment compensation for workers who've lost their jobs. Giving support to small businesses now so they can open their doors and hire these employees back can help get the economy going. These businesses need cash fast, and our plan would provide grants and loans to keep businesses afloat, just like we provided during the pandemic. Our proposed investments also include roads and bridges, healthcare centers, schools, downtowns, and other vital needs. But this is just a start. This report on Hurricane Helene is the first, but it should not be the last. As roads are cleared and debris removed, the region will confront additional needs to rebuild in our mountains where nearly every North Carolina family has made memories. One thing is certain, no matter who is footing the bill, and especially if it's the taxpayers, we need to ensure that homes, businesses, water systems, and roads are rebuilt stronger to withstand future storms. We've been building back stronger in eastern North Carolina as we recovered from Matthew and Florence. It has been more expensive, but it has worked, as we saw from the most recent potential tropical storm cyclone flooding there. With these megastorms hitting our state too frequently, real investments in hardening our infrastructure and rebuilding are not an option. They're a requirement. We've got to make sure we build back stronger. I know that the people of Western North Carolina are strong. Our beautiful mountains hold a special place in my heart. Rebuilding these communities will take everyone working together. And just as we've seen neighborhoods and towns pull together after this devastation, together we will rebuild Western North Carolina. I'm going to invite our director of our Office of State Budget and Management, OSBM Director, Kristen Walker, to come up and present to you the specifics of this report and the money that we are asking from the General Assembly. I also want to thank Director Walker and her team and our folks in the governor's office who have been working on overdrive to get this needs assessment prepared. But before Director Walker gives her presentation, I will take some questions from you guys.
We have time for about 4 to 5. Let's start with Gary. No questions? Great. Dawn.
You said the plan will have the details for the federal and state. Is it still just a month out? Too soon to know the full cost? This is, I mean, pretty large. Are you thinking that the November session will be a time for more funding, or is this the bulk of what's already announced?
So we've got a pretty good idea of what the needs will be, and that's $53 billion. We've done this based on estimates and formulas that we've used in the past that've been pretty accurate. And we believe that if we jumpstart funding now on many of these areas, that will lead to a faster and stronger recovery. There's no question that the General Assembly is going to have to come back and do more, and their assessment of where we are, that's going to be their decision. But we think we can justify this $3.9 billion now and think that that is, the money's there. We think that that'll be a good investment.
All from the savings reserve?
It's from different places, and I'll let Director Walker talk with you about that.
Next question.
Yeah.
Have you spoken to legislative leadership about this, and also what are your expectations that they'll be doing tomorrow in terms of addressing at least some of this?
Yeah, I've talked with the legislators a lot about different phases of this. Yesterday, the day before, last night, our staffs have been working together. And in fact, as agencies have given us requests, we've passed them on to the General Assembly. We know time is of the essence. So in a little different way from the past times, we've sort of been working as a flow. We've been giving them information as we have gotten it. We pulled it all together last night and are presenting it today.
Next question. Yep.
Could you talk more specifically about relief for healthcare centers, especially these smaller clinics, and also any support for public health efforts?
Yeah, we know that healthcare is a problem in rural North Carolina anyway. And that challenge became more acute with Hurricane Helene getting there. We have made proposals to help with public health and to help these healthcare centers, and Director Walker will give you the specifics, but there is no question that making sure that people have access to health care during the storm is going to be paramount. That's been part of the quick response afterwards. People needing their insulin, people needing oxygen, trying to get it to homes that were almost inaccessible. We've had people walking through woods, using ATVs, airdrops, all kinds of things to try to get help to people. And it's going to be really important. One thing that has struck me is I've been to 14 counties, I think, and probably 24 communities in those counties. But I've seen so many healthcare workers that have volunteered and have come from all parts of the state and have been a part of the effort. We've had our EMAC effort that has brought in support from all across the country. So we know that eventually they're going to be moving out as we transition. So we've got to make sure we've got the funding so people can get rural health care.
Guys, time for two more. Yeah, right there.
Have you all identified any communities, counties in particular that have sort of suffered the most
Yeah.
damage?
Yeah, and you know, there are some counties that really took significant devastation. Mitchell and Yancey, you know, come to mind. Buncombe, clearly it took a lot of damage. There are other counties that received severe damages, but I'm thinking of ones that haven't even opened schools yet, that are still working to get water and wastewater systems back, that have flattened power grids. We've gotten the power. We had a million customers were out of power right after the storm. We're down to about a little over 4,000 now. But those 4,000, it's really taking a lot of work to get to them. Our Department of Transportation is working with utilities, clearing roads, finding ways to rebuild the grid in these areas. So we know that these counties that don't have a lot of money anyway are going to have, they're going to need significant help from the state and federal government to recover.
Last question. Great. Thanks, guys.
Great, thank you. Dr. Walker?
Good afternoon. I'm Kristen Walker, State Budget Director and Head of the Office of State Budget and Management. I'm going to walk you through more details on how we arrived at that $53 billion figure, as well as the funding recommendations in the governor's report. I want to echo my thanks, as the governor did, to all of the first responders, National Guard, active duty soldiers, emergency operations workers, and all of the healthcare providers and other personnel on the ground, and of course all of the volunteers who have assisted with this effort. I also want to express a deep well of gratitude for my staff at the Office of State Budget and Management, who have been working pretty much around the clock to prepare this damage and needs assessment in such a short time period. We know that getting help to these folks as quickly as possible is critically important, and thus we needed to do this analysis as quickly as possible. So today I'm just going to provide you with some high-level statistics on the storm and then go into detail on those categories and the state funding recommendations. As you probably know by now, Helene brought record rainfall, flooding, and destruction to western North Carolina. There was more than 30 inches of rainfall, 1,400 landslides. It was a 1,000-year flood, and unfortunately, we've had 96 casualties. As the governor mentioned, nearly 1 million people without power, and 39 FEMA-declared disaster counties now. We know the population in the mountains is unique and faces some unique challenges. Before the storm, even 55% of this population was experiencing a housing cost burden, or housing that was too expensive for them to afford. There are 500,000 people in this area living with disabilities, 1.5 million people almost enrolled in Medicaid, 12% actually without health insurance. 12% of this population lives below the poverty line, and there's a higher percentage of elderly, with more than 18% of the population over the age 65. And we also know that the nature of the damage that we have seen creates several complexities. These came up as we tried to assess the damage and also, of course, as people try to respond, rescue, and recover. So we know about impaired access. The damage to the roads is significant. We know the difficulties in communication. At one point, you had more than 1,000 cell service providers, cell service down. And we know the disparate nature of these communities. So there's a wide variety of size and communities out there with different levels of access to those communities. The impacts are severe and long-lasting, and the recovery is likely to be costly. So not just the amount, of course, of the damages and needs, but actually getting into these communities is just on the face of it going to be more expensive. We anticipate, so far 158,000 households have applied for individual assistance. We anticipate that number rising probably above 220,000 total applications. In this area, we know that only about 7 to 8% of homes have FEMA verified flood insurance. So we know that this community does not have flood insurance. Private insurance will not be picking up the tab for these things. And of course, the damage to infrastructure, as we've mentioned. We've lost 163 water and sewer systems. There's more than 400 hazardous waste sites, and at least 6,000 miles of roads and more than 1,000 bridges and culverts have been damaged. As we begin the recovery, several challenges. We know that construction costs are significantly higher since COVID-19. There will also be, unfortunately, a competition for labor and materials because of all the disasters that have happened across the Southeast. And then we also know that this storm hit at the worst time in the mountains, right at the peak of tourist season, and there will be multi-year economic damages due to that. However, as the governor mentioned, we have to build stronger, safer, and smarter. We have to do that for the people of Western North Carolina, and we also have to do it because it is the right thing to do with taxpayer dollars. Looking at a study out of the Belfer Center at Harvard, we know that leading recoveries are characterized by an ability to move capital quickly and flexibly. And so the governor's recommendations, you will see, strives to put money into these communities as quickly and flexibly as possible. We know that communities who receive that funding quickly and flexibly outperform their peers in GDP growth 5 years down the road. We also know that investing in mitigation measures and other strengthening measures saves money. You can see the statistics on the page. In addition to being in compliance with the latest building codes, saves money as well. So to get at our damage and needs, the $53.6 billion figure, $41 billion of that comes from an estimated direct cost. 7.6 comes through indirect or induced, so overflow effects, and then 4.8 billion of that is related to strengthening and mitigation. This is our preliminary estimate. We will continue to refine this estimate, anticipating releasing another report in mid-November. We don't have some of the data yet from the DOI, the Department of Insurance on insurance claims, as well as all the IA and PA data, obviously, as folks are still applying for those programs. And we know that DOT and others on the ground will continue to perform assessments that will better inform our numbers. However, we do know that this estimate, as large as it is in line with what other outside entities have developed. So you can see Moody's and CoreLogic estimating what they think the damage from the storm is, and you can see those numbers, which are in line with our numbers. So you can see here what we expect. So 53.6 in total damages and needs. We're anticipating about 6.3 billion in private and other funding. As more data comes in, these numbers will be refined, but you can see that some of you may pick up on that number seems low. Part of that is due to the low rates of insurance. So we do not anticipate insurance picking up a high percentage of these costs. Expected federal funding, we will continue to refine and develop this, but this is not an automatic amount. This is an amount that we will have to ask from Congress for most of these programs. So we will continue to work on that and prepare information for a congressional request when they return in November. The state has already put in about $300 million, $273 million, leaving us with a total unfunded damage and needs of $33.4 billion. So today, the governor puts forward 3.9 in total funding recommendations, which is about 12% of the share of the unfunded damages and needs. So you can see that it is a wonderful place to start, but it is probably not the finish. Even after, if the state were to invest that whole amount, you can see that we would have almost $30 billion in unfunded needs. Particularly the economy will be affected by that. As I mentioned, this is peak tourist season. Also housing and transportation. So we will continue to work on those estimates and refine that, but know that even with this investment, there is still much more to be done. So now I'm going to jump into a little bit more detail. We did this analysis over 9 categories. 5 of them, which I've got up on the screen now, account for 94% of our estimated total. So we'll spend the most time on those. Economy, housing, utilities and natural resources, transportation, agriculture, and then we looked at government, education, health and human services, and we also began a preliminary assessment of the damage to tribal and federal lands as well. So economy. We're estimating the damage to the economy or to businesses at $15.9 billion. This is non-agricultural, but it also includes nonprofits. 500,000 businesses in these 39 disaster-declared counties. 45% of North Carolina's GDP can be found in these disaster-declared counties. And tourism is $8 billion of this region's total annual economic output. So to miss this tourist season and potentially into the winter and beyond is incredibly devastating to the economy here. So the governor recommends in proposed state funding, the largest of this would be a Helene Business Recovery Grant Program of $475 million. This would be grants, not loans. Phase 1 of this would go to the counties where there's greater than 10% of the population has applied for IA, so the hardest hit counties based on IA applications. These grants would range in size from $1,500 to $50,000 and would cap of $50,000 and would be based on taxable sales. We anticipate about 25,000 grants in this manner. This grant program would include agricultural worker businesses, including farmers, and that you also see this in the agriculture section. This funding could go out within the next, very quickly. This is modeled after a program that the Department of Revenue ran during the pandemic, so the state knows how to do this and can get the money out. This is the most efficient way to get this money in the hand of business owners. Phase 2 of this program would actually would cover all 39 counties and would be based on loss of gross receipts. So you would have to demonstrate actual loss. So you'd have to have at least a 20% loss. It would be based on Q4 from 2023 compared to Q4 of 2024. Once businesses could do that, they could start to apply for those funds as early as January or February. This program would have a $75,000 cap, and we estimate it would cost $350 million. The next item I'll just mention on this is you may have heard about Golden Leaf and their partnership with Mountain BizWorks. These are loans. The governor is recommending putting another $50 million into that. Mountain BizWorks has already done $7 billion in funding this way and has a very high demand for that program, but another option. And I will mention at this time, too, that when we do our estimation of the Small Business Administration, we all know the difficulties they're having due to a lack of funding. But even if they had funding, our economists think that Small Business Administration loans will only amount to about $175 million for the state. So think about that economic loss of $16 billion. And even if SBA had the funding, we don't anticipate that to come anywhere near meeting the needs. We also propose some programs around local infrastructure grants. So these would be things out of our Department of Commerce, like Main Streets and rural infrastructure development, as well as programs for small businesses, hub businesses, minority and women-owned businesses as well. Housing is our next largest category of damages and needs, coming in at almost $15 billion. As I mentioned before, about 92% of the households with damage do not have flood insurance, so they will not be able to rely on private insurance to cover these losses. And we have a high percentage that was in this community region that was already overburdened by housing costs. This is an area where we do expect this federal government to put in significant money, but the main program that the federal government does that through is the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery. That is an ask we have to make of Congress, and then you have to wait on Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, to issue the Federal Register. In our past experience, it's taken 18 months for 2 years for that process to make it through. So this is an area where right now the governor is recommending the state go ahead and put in $325 million into what would be a HUD-compliant homeowner recovery program to get the ball rolling and to get things started. One of the lessons learned that we know is that waiting on the federal government and having a program that is entirely too federally fund reliant means there are delays that are simply unacceptable to homeowners on the ground and those awaiting to have their homes rebuilt. By designing this program that is HUD compliant, we can ensure a smooth transition for homeowners who hopefully would not even know if their funding came either from a state dollar or a federal dollar, because we would go ahead and get this started now. With this much estimated in damages and needs, there doesn't seem to be any danger of supplanting federal funds because there's just so much need out there for housing recovery. You can also see the second largest item here is the state match needed for FEMA individual assistance. As I mentioned before, we're anticipating about 220,000 people eventually receiving FEMA IA. There's also programs around affordable housing, programs directed at the homeless population, as well as temporary weatherization and other areas. About 126,000 homes we are estimating right now have damage. And we know that about 70% of homes in this region are on septic, which will require unique challenges as they attempt to rebuild, and also leads us to concerns around utilities, which is what I will talk about next. Utilities and natural resources, almost $7 billion in damages. The number I mentioned before, that 163 water and sewer systems damaged, as well as the cellular outages and the more than 500 potential hazardous sites that need to be cleaned up. This is another area where we will rely heavily on the federal government assisting us. You can see a large amount put in here for now for FEMA matching funds. Also funding to do water infrastructure and interconnection of some of these systems. We know that interconnection is difficult for these communities without some funding to assist with that, but may be the path forward. We know that some folks may need to get connected to a sewer line instead of going back to having a septic system once their home is rebuilt. And so we're including funds in that. We also have $50 million going towards the Park and Rest Trust Fund to assist locals with restoring their parks, as well as various flood abatement, water quality measures. Also a fair amount of mapping and modeling. We know that the flood maps need to be updated, both what DEQ, the part that environmental quality does, as well as environmental management's mapping and modeling as well. Much of this in the area of dams, microgrids, grid resiliency, and hardening, we would look to the federal government for significant investment that the state would then match. But again, that's not a guarantee. That is an ask we will make. Next, I'll talk about transportation. Currently, we're estimating the damage to transportation sector at almost $10 billion. There's 6,000 miles of roads damaged, bridges and culverts damaged, and we also at this point in time are estimating 3,000 to 5,000 private roads and bridges. Typically, the state does not take responsibility for private roads and bridges. There's been some work done after Tropical Storm Fred. State did this on a smaller scale, about 300 private roads and bridges. But we know that the need there is significant. We know that's how people access their homes. So a wide variety of complications with that. We are currently working with the federal government to try to figure out a program that might assist those folks. So the dollar amount you see here, total estimated damages to private roads and bridges is closer to $460 million. But this is the amount that we would recommend the state start to get to work with while we wait on the federal government. Next area, largest area, is agriculture, so that's the 5th largest area. We are looking at about $3.4 billion in damages, $1.3 billion in crop loss. Similar to what you heard around housing, we estimate only 5 to 10% of these farmers are covered by insurance. So a very high rate of uninsured here. We know it's about 18,000 farms across this region. The other thing to note is the vast difference between the cash crops you have in the eastern part of the state and the more specialty crops that you have in the western part of the state. So those specialty crops can have a longer growing cycle. It can take quite a long time for those communities to recover. It's, you might take 5 to 10 years to actually regrow apple orchards, blueberry farms, et cetera. So we know that this redevelopment of agricultural lands could take years. I mentioned the Phase 1 business program. All farmers in all 37 counties, excluding those that were just struck by tornadoes, will be eligible actually for that Phase 1 business recovery grant. So that's the immediate funds that we can get out within the next couple of months. And then in the long term, we recommend an agriculture disaster farmer recovery program. This would be based on verified losses and actually run by the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. They ran a very similar program during Florence. And so they would estimate that, looking at have folks apply and then see what the verified losses were and see what their available funding was to determine those payments. Second largest area here, and this really spreads across agriculture and impacts just about everything, but is stream debris removal and stabilization. So we know that there is all kinds of debris in these waterways right now. Folks are working to get that debris out of there. USDA NRCS has committed to $250 million. They require a match on those funds. So we have $90 million for that match, as well as some other items around stream debris removal. But we anticipate there will be much more to come with cleaning up the stream debris and removal items. And then also other smaller programs, including putting more money into the Ag Development and Farmland Preservation Trust Fund for conservation easements and other measures. Finally, I'll just mention it's the smallest dollar amount, but concerns about the wildfire season. And so some additional funds put in there, especially after this storm and with the amount of debris that's out there. The next area I'll talk about is government and recovery operations, about $1.4 billion in damages. We know of all the state parks that are closed. You know of the damages to some of the state-owned facilities. We know there's a lot of state-owned land out in the mountains as well. The largest part of the recommendations here is additional match funds and cash flow needs. This would go to the Division of Emergency Management. The first bill 2 weeks ago did $250 million. We recommend another $250 million. We know that FEMA will reimburse us for many things, but that is a long process, and the department needs cash flow to assist with that. We also know that we will need match funds to draw down other FEMA and other federal dollars. So this amount would cover that as well for now. We did a survey of all the state-owned facilities, and so we know that there is going to be about a little over $100 million needed to repair and renovate some of these state-owned facilities, new roofs, flooding damage, et cetera. The other item I'll mention here is additional state matching funds. So the General Assembly has appropriated some funds for state match for IIJA, CHIPS, and the Inflation Reduction Act. Those are large federal programs many of these programs are competitive in nature. We would recommend drawing down more of that federal money by putting up more state match funds that agencies can apply for. Unfortunately, I think we have a very compelling case to the federal government about why we should receive lots of those funds, but we need match funds and technical assistance to enable state agencies to apply for them. And then again, some more local capacity grants to cover things like lost tax revenue and other immediate needs for them, as well as grants that would run through the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources in a variety of areas, additional funding in areas where they already provide that. Next area is education. There's about 1,000 schools in this region, about 900,000 students. We know there's 23 community colleges and 7 UNC system institutions out in this region. 3 UNC system institutions sustained the most damage, but actually survived surprisingly well. Similar story of what we know right now of K-12 schools. Not a lot of damage to the actual schools, although lots of damage obviously to the water and sewer systems that supply those schools. In response, the governor has $100 million for community colleges and for K-12, so that'd be split $75 million for K-12, $25 million for community colleges. Putting some funds into the public school insurance fund. They're anticipating having at least $50 million in claims, and so they need the funding to pay those. They don't have that currently in their balance. We're also providing some flexible funds to the K-12, community college, and the UNC system for operations as they get back to school. State match funding, as well as funding for summer learning programs. We know from the pandemic that these summer learning programs can make a big difference in student success, so we recommend that we commit to paying for those now. And of course, mental health services and other needs that students will have as they return. Health and Human Services, comprising about $700 million of the damages and needs. As mentioned, there was about 145 healthcare facilities impacted. We know that there are 55 child care centers with damage right now that's preventing them from reopening. Needs related to public health, behavioral health, and of course the vulnerable populations mentioned at the beginning. There's a whole bunch of items funded in this space, including food banks and food insecurity programs, childcare, as I mentioned, match funds needed for DSNAP and other programs that you have heard about as well. The last area that I will mention, and we don't yet have a determination on this, is tribal and federal lands. So we have been talking with the Eastern Band of the Cherokee. We hope to include their numbers in our final report to get a full assessment of the damages to everything within the state boundaries. They luckily sustained minimal damage, but they have been talking with us. Of course, they would have access to federal funding and other funds, but just to get a sense of the full scope, we'd like to include them in the final report. The other thing I will mention is that the report, and which I think you all have a copy and I know is available on our website, there's also other disasters that the state, we know of Tropical Storm Debbie, PTC 8, as well as the agricultural drought, so we have information on those, as well as remaining needs from Hurricanes Matthew and Florence. So the governor has a recommendation around those storms as well so that we can complete those recoveries and also remember those folks in the eastern part of our state. So in closing, the big numbers here are that $53.6 billion, the 3.9 that the governor is recommending, and also the best practice and the lesson learned we know, which is that immediate flexible funds are what is critical to a robust recovery for the people in Western North Carolina. So with that, I am happy to take questions. Dawn.
Just as during the presentation, the Berger's office about something pointing out this, part of the request is $175 million for the Recovery and Resiliency Florence Homeowners Recovery Program needs. Is there a reason that's part of this request?
Yes, so as I mentioned, we're trying to include funding for the other storms. You can see that $175 million detailed, and if you have the reports available on our website, but also if you have a hard copy, that funding is outlined on page 98. This is a good point in relation to federal funding. We asked the federal government for $1.1 billion for CDBG-DR for Florence. They gave us about half of that, and we now know, now that applications have closed out, that we need about another $175 million to finish the homes that were damaged during Florence. So that estimate is included here. We also know that we need that money very soon, so it's timely, and the General Assembly needs to address that as quickly as possible. Here.
Follow up on that, though, Senator Berger's office and Senator Brent Jackson indicated that, you know, you've known about this for weeks, maybe months, and you're just now asking for it. How do you respond to that?
So we have become aware of this in recent weeks. It took a while to untangle what the need actually was, and then of course we've been working on Helene rescue and recovery as well. I can say that we've been talking with the General Assembly for longer than just today about this.
I wanted to ask about something you mentioned in the, I think, the government and recovery ops piece of it. You said replacing some lost tax revenue from local governments. Could you give a little bit more detail on exactly what that means?
So we know that a lot of these local governments are going to suffer pretty significant loss in revenue, and so those grant funds would enable them, provide them with basically funding to assist with things. We also know that the federal government offers a program called the Community Disaster Loan Program that local governments can apply for. So that is another way that they can meet some of those needs, and we will most certainly, I think, be making an ask to Congress to expand the Community Disaster Loan Program as they did after Hurricane Katrina. So they were much more generous after Katrina with those communities, providing more funding and eventually actually canceling and forgiving those loans. So, anyone else?
I want to clarify. I don't know if it had been months that they've been told that, definitely weeks. You mentioned that the unmet need was $33 billion, which is basically a year's worth of state government funding.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like a big ask that even over a 10-year period you could get that kind of money. Should state government or the people in North Carolina be resolved with the fact that some of these damages will never be recompensed?
Yes, I think that is often the case when you have these. That was certainly the case with Florence. That's the overall assessment of how much damage and need there was. Certainly, especially when you get into things like induced or indirect, you don't expect anyone to really recover that loss. The key difference, I would say, here, though, is this low rate of insurance, which is going to alter the picture for these folks, and indeed potentially alter the picture of what the state or the federal government is willing to do. But no, I don't think anyone anticipates that anywhere near the full $53 billion would be covered. All right, thank you all.